Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another exciting virtual tour with myself, Chris Staudinger, and of course the Foss Waterway Seaport. And tonight we're talking about work boats, very specifically boats, well, that do work. And what gets left out of that designation? Well, pleasure craft, speedboats, anything that would be used for just personal use. Yachts go into the non-work boat category. We're talking about specialty passenger ferries, tugboats, barges, things like that. And we're here tonight because of our generous sponsor, Columbia Bank. So first, a word from them.
I've been a commercial fisherman for 41 years. Truly is a magical place out there. I've been with Columbia Bank as long as this boat's been to sea. As a commercial fisherman, we have income pulses that are directly related to seasonal activities. If that propeller ain't turning, you're not earning. Columbia Bank tailored this loan to fit our business needs perfectly. They made me happy as a clam at high tide.
Which of course brings us to our final category of work boats, fishing boats. And I think when people consider Tacoma and its narrative, they don't really think about how much maritime history we have here and the reason that there is a city on the coast here at all. The reason that we were so popular is because, of course, the train had a very easy access to our deep water port on a nice shallow tide plane. But the reason that people were coming out here in the beginning was, of course, the water. Commencement Bay can be up to 600 feet deep. And so it was a natural spot for something like a deep water lumber port, which is really what Tacoma started out as, and then also became a fishing town. A lot of Croatian, Japanese, and Norwegian immigrants started coming to the Tacoma area as early as the 1870s and popularized this location as a major fishing destination. Wow. Woo, we'll see how it goes tonight. Good to see you all. I'm glad you guys are here. If you have questions along the way, please just let me know. I'll do my best to answer them. Here we go. Let's take a look at the most famous work boats in the area. So if any of you went down to the Foss Waterway Seaport tonight, you would have got to see the work boats that they have out there right now. They've got 3 of them down there right now, including this one right here, the Roland Foss. They also have Creosote down there, which was a tugboat right here. This was built in 1921 up in Ballard, the Ballard Ship and Railway Company. And this was built for Pacific Creosoting Company and is iconic to the tugboats that you would have seen in the area here. And while they come in all shapes and sizes, you really see a lot from tugboats to fishing boats with a very similar design, and a lot of them becoming popular in the 1920s. The vast majority of the boats that we're going to talk about today really got their start from 1915 to 1925. And then a lot of them had continued their operation up to today. In fact, a not insignificant portion of the fishing fleet that's up in the Seattle Ballard Locks area still operates with their original 100-plus-year-old wooden boats that were created for this purpose. And at least, I'm trying to think here right now, 3 of the boats that we're going to talk about tonight as well are, if not in their original purpose, still out functioning today. And I get to see it. Yeah. How long will they be there? I think until tomorrow. And I know that today was free admission for it. I believe you can go down and see them tomorrow, but they're traveling all over. And so if you miss them here, there's a good chance that you'll get to see them somewhere else in Puget Sound. And I'll have to check their calendar of events. I think they were just down in Olympia or possibly in Bremerton. I know that sometimes they work their way out to Port Townsend. They're part of a collection of traditional wooden work boats representing the early 1920s in Puget Sound. And they go around doing educational programs in the area. But this is where you would have seen them. So this is a picture from 1915, and this represents part of the Mosquito fleet. And you can't talk about work boats in the area without really focusing on the Mosquito fleet. If you're not familiar, if you haven't tuned in before, the Mosquito fleet is the sort of catch-all term that talks about all of the various boats that were working the Puget Sound region from the 1880s up into basically late 1920s is when you start to see the mosquito fleet phase out. And the reason for this was it was difficult to make roads in Washington. All of the original settlements and towns and cities in Washington state on the west side were built because they had easy access to the water. And then the easiest way to get from one to the other was via boat. So much easier than trying to log and grade and create roads through the vast, dense Pacific coast forests we have out here. And so as different captains just purchased their own boats and set up their own independent enterprises, this variously became known as the Mosquito Fleet. And it gets this name from the fact that these captains were intense. And a lot of the tall ships that would come into port carrying various cargoes would have to have one of these boats bring them into the narrow slips. And they would get swarmed by all the different vessels, all of these captains trying to shove each other out of the way, race each other there to become the captain that would tow them in and thus make the money. And so this swarm of fleet ships that were cruising around Puget Sound at the time became affectionately known as the Mosquito Fleet. And so this is right down here on the waterfront in Tacoma. You can see in the back here, let's see if I can get the cursor. That is the clock tower of Old City Hall. And then right up front here where the Tacoma Municipal Dock Building is, this is, of course, the long section that was once the longest grain warehouse in the country. The only remaining section today is, of course, the Foss Waterway Seaport and Museum down there. And you see a lot of vessels like this when you start to research the Mosquito Fleet. This is the Telegraph. And this is docked up at the Sumner Iron Works in Everett at the time. This was put into use, I believe, in 1903 and originally was used for the Seattle-Tacoma run, which absolutely hurts me beyond recognition at this point because there used to be a direct ferry route from Tacoma to Seattle and vice versa. And now it takes, I mean, you can barely get the commuter train anymore, let alone go through traffic during rush hour. But it was the thing that you would take these steam powered paddle wheel boats up and down Puget Sound to get wherever you needed to go. Another big development that really changed the region was the invention of the tugboat. And for that, you have to go back to essentially 1802. This is the Charlotte Dundas, which was built by a guy named William Symington and is another steam powered paddle wheel vessel. And this was designed and invented by this guy, William, to be used as a cargo transportation and tight maneuvering vessel in Scotland. And one of the things that really separates tugboats, workboats, from a variety of other vessels is the vast amount of power that they can produce for such a small body. Time and time again, when you look at tugboats from 1802 to now, the thing that you'll notice is that they are way overpowered. They put all of their stats into strength and thus really allows them to move massive amounts of whatever it is, from a cargo vessel to a barge of gravel, rock. A lot of log barges would come through Puget Sound at the time. And so their job was to be able to maneuver in tighter quarters and take these really massive vessels and put them somewhere else. And I think you probably saw a little bit of that clip in the opening there, how tugboats are still used to this day to move these massive cargo vessels into place alongside docks. Port of Tacoma is the 5th largest port in the United States and thus has quite a bit of vessels coming into it periodically. And to help them maneuver in those tight quarters, tugboats are still very much used today. Here's a little cross example of what we were looking at that first tugboat out there. So if you're going to talk about tugboats in Tacoma specifically, we got to go to the Foss industry. Now, I'm a huge fan of the Foss family and all that they've done in the area here. I'll give it to you in brief, just in case you're new here. But of course, Thea Foss and her husband Andrew, leave Norway because it was cold and difficult to make a living there. They arrived in the Midwest where they're like, wow, this is even colder and more difficult. So they continued moving westward on the train until they arrived here in Tacoma, where Andrew lovingly, from scrap lumber he gathered on shore, built this floating boathouse for his wife and children. And they lived on the top and then operated business eventually off of the bottom level here. But Taya always just kept her lifelong fear of the water to herself and then continued to live in this houseboat for quite some time. She ends up, while Andrew was away working as a carpenter, taking the last $5 in their coffee can, buying a tugboat, or not a tugboat, but a rowboat, cleaning it, painting it white and green, and then flipping it for a profit. And doing this a few more times so that by the time Andrew gets home from his contracting job, she's made $41 in profit, renting these rowboats for 50 cents a day. And now she has a fleet that she's operating right down here on the waterfront in Tacoma. And when it was still called the City Waterway, now the Foss Waterway, it was this impassable section of water where it was incredibly dangerous to go across a railroad bridge or impossible sometimes to get from one end of the water over. And so they made a tremendous amount of their original fortune renting boats as ferries to help people get across the water to go work in the port, or for people who are looking for pleasure boats going out rowing for the day, or fishermen and duck hunters were another big sort of cash crop for the Foss industry out there. And so as they're renting these rowboats, they start to expand the business more and more until they realize that there's going to be a lot of money in tenders. And so eventually Taya and Andrew get together and they buy a series of boats that they start renting out for a Foss water taxi service. And that grows both in popularity and success. And as they acquire more and more launches, they start operating, bringing supplies out to the various cargo vessels that were coming in the area. And by 1904, they still don't have their first tugboat, but the Foss industry had already made a name for itself. And the sons of the Foss Empire were very clever in that working with people out in Port Townsend, they were essentially cutting deals so that they would be notified first when a cargo vessel was coming to Tacoma. And so they could go out early and bring just a box of like apples or a box of oranges and be like, hey, welcome to the area. If you need anything, we're the Foss family. We're here for you. And so beautiful salesmanship, instantly establish good rapport, demonstrate their ability to bring stuff to and from vessels. And they were inevitably going to be the one getting the contract, bringing in these large cargo vessels or bringing out supplies to a lot of them. They would use these small launches pictured here to bring vessels whatever they needed. And as the maritime industry in the area continued to develop, you see a lot of iconic shots like this, where those grain warehouses were just being filled with wheat pouring in off of the railroad and then going out on vessels. There needed to be someone in the area who was capable of helping these large ships maneuver. And so that's what you see here. This shot's from 1912. And around about this time, the Army Corps of Engineers dredged the City Waterway, now the Foss Waterway, to be wide enough that when these large vessels were coming in, they could pivot 360 degrees in the waterway, allowing them to come up right along the docks for whatever they needed. Timber, grain, anything that was coming in or out of Tacoma would leave from these docks. And to maneuver it, the Foss Company becomes the one to get the tugboat industry going here. And they purchased their first tug in 1912. It was a 5-year-old 37-foot vessel that they renamed Foss 9. And eventually the Foss family goes on to rename all of their vessels after members of the Foss family. The most famous one that they own is, of course, the Andrew Foss. But at the time, they were very classic Norwegians. So it was Foss 1, Foss 2, all the way up to their first tugboat, which was now Foss 9. And with the Foss 9, they revolutionized this industry here. And so you can kind of get, this is a picture from 1895, where you can see the original bridge that went across the City Waterway there. This today would be the 11th Street lift bridge. And then eventually, through just compounding their interests and skills, they end up becoming the Foss Maritime Company, which still operates in the Pacific Northwest, though no longer privately owned by the Foss family. And you will still see Foss tugs from the southern part of California all the way up through Alaska. Here they are carrying parts for windmills, electricity generating windmills up the Columbia River. So the white and green is still the iconic colors of the Foss Maritime Company today, and you'll see them all over. But here's their original. This was the one purchased in 1916. This is their 5-year-old Foss number 9. And this remained in service as a tugboat up until 1968, right? So it was built in 1911, purchased by the Foss family in 1916, and then continued service until 1968. And what you can kind of see just a little bit here is that each of these tugboats also was retrofitted for a variety of purposes. A few years after they got Foss number 9, their second tug, I believe, in the lineup was Foss 12. And Foss 12 was built with the purpose of being both a tugboat and a fireboat. And I don't think I can stress enough just how valuable that is in Port of Tacoma. So many times we caught fire from various things down on the waterfront, but because of the rapid response of these tugboats, which were retrofitted to be able to pump water out really quickly in vast quantities, a lot of the shoreline was saved. And in fact, the Foss family ends up moving from kind of where the Foss Seaport is today across the water into the Wheeler-Osgood Waterway, which if you've seen the Foss Waterway ever on a map, there's sort of this arm that goes off into the distance. That used to be part of the Puyallup River. When that got filled in so that the water no longer flowed in there, this became an area where the Wheeler-Osgood company set up shop, and they produced furniture in-house. They were a milling company that created their own furniture, and log rafts would be floated in. They would take them out, mill them down, and then create this furniture. But what was left over was a great deal of sawdust, which they burned. And to burn it, they put it in this enormous contraption called a beehive burner, where you just shovel in all your stuff, you light it up, and hopefully nothing catches fire. But at least 18 different times it did. So, hey, welcome everyone. I'm glad to see you guys are here. And yes, no joke, the vessels that we're talking about tonight were absolutely built to last. They have managed to survive so much. And in particular, we're going to talk about one today called the Western Flyer, which has gone through such ordeals in its lifetime, but continues out there today. So here is a picture of 1931 Foss Company's launch and tug company. This is the largest fleet of tugs on the Puget Sound at the time. They're right out front of their waterfront office. And you can see Tacoma skyline up there right in the background right here. That's the peak of Stadium High School. You can just barely make out the tower right here. That's First Presbyterian Church. You might recognize. Oh, that's not quite lining up here. This is the last one was a tree. This is the peak of First Presbyterian right here. And at the time, they had their main office at 400 Dock Street, and they continued to move it all around. But this shows the 12 tugboats in their operation at that time. And you can see the variety of sizes and purposes that they had there. And this is also right next to a small service boat lined up next there for, I don't know, size comparison, I suppose. But I think the largest tug at this time would have been the Andrew Foss. The Andrew Foss tugboat is 97 feet long, and it was built in 1905. And the smallest tug is at the far right next to the service boat. It is this white one right here. That's the Peggy Foss. She's 32 feet long, built in 1912. And like everything at the time, something caught fire. And so on Monday, November 23rd, 1931, a fire did destroy the Foss Company offices. Ironically, they were not able to extinguish that blaze in time, even though they had the vast majority of fireboats under their command at the time. So they just rebuilt on the same site. And in 1943, they moved to Middle Waterway. But they were operating all of these Foss tugboats at the time. And this one right here, this is the Peter Foss. This is 62 feet long, 19 feet abeam, so 19 feet wide for my lubbers out there, and has a 375 horsepower Western Enterprise diesel engine. And like, I can't stress enough how cool these boats are, because they are so vastly overpowered, and they just became the working mascots of the waterfront. 1920s, I think through probably the 1950s, one of the coolest things that you could have been was like a tugboat captain. It was up there with like sailing around the world, being independently wealthy. People were like, what do you want to be? And kids were like, I want to be a tugboat captain. That's the coolest thing ever. And to give that some context, you got to think a lot of these tugboats were becoming popular in the United States in the like 1950 through the 1930s, which leads very much into the Depression era. And there was something almost mythological about the tugboat captains, who were these hardworking people who continued industry running in a time when the nation was gasping for air. Take that and then translate it from the 1930s into the 1940s. And now you have this industrious force that's working to mobilize the US Navy for preparation to enter into World War II. And really, these are the blue collar heroes of the United States. And to contribute to that myth, I don't know if anyone was more instrumental than Tugboat Annie. So Tugboat Annie was represented in a weekly installment in a magazine. She had 2 different movies and then went on also for a television series. This particular photograph is taken from 1933 when Tugboat Annie, this time starring Marie Dressler and Wallace Beery, debuted here in Tacoma. And they filmed it using one of the Foss tugboats, the Arthur Foss. And it premiered here in Tacoma in October of 1933. Absolute box office success. And goes on to create this whole industry of Tugboat Annie merchandise and mythology. I'm going to play a little clip for you of Tugboat Annie. But she was an American hero. She was a woman captain, and she had her nemesis that she was always competing against, and she was the captain. She was the captain of the Narcissus, and constantly through her intelligence, her pluck, and often through a fist fight, she always managed to win the day and keep her family going through the 1930s. Check this out.
I'll get even with you if it takes the rest of my natural life.
The Adventures of Tugboat Annie.
So yes, Tugboat Annie is captain of the Narcissus. Her nemesis in life, Captain Bullwinkle, that doofus you just saw, is captain of the Salamander, which is the perfect melodrama just waiting to unfold on the silver screen. And all of this takes place in the mythical city of Tacoma. And the life and times of Tugboat Annie are based on the mythology of Foss. And they diverge pretty greatly in that Foss was a soft-spoken, introverted Norwegian woman who was instrumental in the diplomacy of the city of Tacoma and was really iconic, not just in building this maritime industry here, but also setting up a place where Norwegian immigrants could come and learn the language and get acquainted with the area and get jobs. She always had a pot of coffee ready and was there at all times to help settle disputes between the tastemakers in Tacoma. Whereas Tugboat Annie, not afraid of the water, is this rambunctious, really loud speaking fisticuffs captain. And she's the hero we need, as is Foss. So the truth is somewhere in the middle between the two of them. But the success of Tugboat Annie can't be overstated. And so when they came and filmed in Tacoma, it was a huge deal. And at that time, I think that movie also had co-star Ronald Reagan, back when he was still just an actor. And then this is them on the bridge of the Andrew Foss, I believe, at the time. So movie stars, entrepreneurs, maritime aficionados, the Foss family becomes the family to create a workboat industry in the Puget Sound. And they diversify just from pleasure craft to launches to tugboats. And like I said, one of the big things that they did was create some for safety. So this is one of their early boats here. Eventually, they would go on to create more tugboats like this one. This is Diamond B, which is towing one of these massive cranes on a Foss barge. And if you haven't ever gone out in the early morning and seen when the cranes come into Tacoma, this is still how they do it. They load up those massive brontosaurus-looking cargo cranes that go to Port of Tacoma in China, fully erected, and then send them across the Pacific Ocean like that, and then they get tugged into place here in Tacoma. And it is absolutely astounding to see them roll out of the early morning mist across Commencement Bay. But it's the same design that they've always done. This one, I'm trying to think here, Foss number 17 is the tugboat that's behind the crane here. And you can see, here it is. This is Foss number 12. That's the one I was telling you about. And this one, you can see it better here, has the fire hoses equipped on it, but it was at its heart a tugboat. And one of the things that made this one so particularly famous is that it was responsible for bringing in the 48 concrete anchor blocks, each one weighing 600 tons, that they built the Tacoma Narrows Bridge with. And what's mind-blowing about this, wrap your head around it if you can, this is a 600-ton concrete block, which they have designated the location for. They're going to get some guides and tethers for it. And now they're about to flood the side of this deck barge so that that concrete block is going to slide off of it and then sink to the bottom of the Tacoma Narrows, approximately 200 feet down, depending where you are, and then become the anchor point for the bridge, which, of course, yes, the first one fell down, but that wasn't anything to do with the anchors. They just should have designed it with open girders, but I digress. So they become folk heroes in the area. The Foss Company is building the Narrows Bridge. It was responsible for bringing Yukon gold miners down. It is driving the industry in Port of Tacoma. They survived the Great Depression. This is the company. And remember, it begins with this little tugboat right here. This is Foss number 9. The wee little 37-footer that started the whole tugboat industry here in the Pacific Northwest. And this is of the Bryn Foss. You can see this one. This one was popular in the 1940s. And you can see what it's doing here is taking out an MSC 290. That's a minesweeper. The Tacoma area was really popular. I believe the most successful city in the United States during the 1940s in creating wooden minesweepers. And because a lot of naval mines are predominantly magnetic, if you want to decrease the chances of your vessel exploding, you build it out of wood. And that's not cost effective or safe for a lot of things like warships or battleships. But if you're going to make a minesweeper, cherry on the pie. And so a lot of these wooden minesweepers were designed here in Tacoma and then brought out to sea by the tugboats. So if you're growing up in the area and you're seeing these tugboats constantly fueling the war effort, they truly become the stuff of legend and intensely popular in the area. This is a 1933 photograph of the tugboat, which was employed as municipal garbage. This is the tugboat Wallowa, built in Portland in 1889. And for over 40 years, this assisted sailboats on the Columbia River predominantly. Their job would have been log rafts, grain barges, and then, of course, other cargo vessels that were going up and down the Columbia River. And this worked all the way from Portland, Oregon, to Skagway, Alaska. Eventually sold to the Foss Launch and Tug Company in 1929, where she continued to operate in service for decades. Here's the real crown jewel, though. So this is the Arthur Foss. The Arthur Foss was built in 1889, like I said, as the Wallowa. When it was resold to the Foss Company, they renamed it to the Arthur Foss, and this is where she begins her career as the most famous tugboat in the area. And not only did she serve from 1889 on, going all the way up to Alaska and down, but when she came to the Puget Sound to work for the Foss Company, that wasn't by any means limiting. So the Arthur Foss continued to operate all the way across the Pacific. At one point, even going over bringing military supplies to Pearl Harbor, and then out to Wake Island, where they were constructing some defenses out there. The Arthur Foss was the last boat to leave Wake Island before the Japanese attack out there, and then just barely made it all the way out to Hawaii. And their story about that is pretty fascinating. Let's see if I can get the photo for you guys here. When they were out on Wake Island, they were bringing the supplies out there. And then, hold on, this is the Mercury Tacoma. Here we go. They brought out these supplies to Wake Island. They got advance warning that there was going to be Japanese attack. And so they mixed up grease and gray paint that they had on board and painted their vessel just like in the heart of nighttime, so it was less visible, because as a bright white and green tugboat under its own power going across the Pacific Ocean, they were an instant target for a Japanese attack. So they just managed to camouflage into the gray of the ocean and creep their way all the way over to Hawaii, just barely arriving with fuel in their tank to get them there. And I can't tell you just how overpowered this vessel was. It was strong enough to make its way across the Pacific Ocean and to carry a tremendous amount of cargo as it went. Eventually, this vessel goes on, here it is in its early days here, to work again as a tugboat in the area. They bring it back over and then get it retrofitted. And here it is today. It is currently the oldest continuously working wooden tugboat in the world. It's up in the Seattle area right now, where the Foss Maritime Company is currently headquartered. And from 1889 to today, this has had a career. And you can get onto it and get to explore it today. I'm going to share a link with you guys a little bit later. There's an amazing 15-minute video about it on YouTube, where the captain of it and the company that works with it talks a little bit about their time and sort of what it's like to be on board it. But if you're interested, it is up in the Seattle area and is just the most iconic, I think, tugboat, not just of the Foss enterprise, but of the Puget Sound maritime industry, to be the oldest continuously serving, but also the flagship of the Foss fleet is pretty extraordinary. And I think talks a little bit about just how popular the tugboat industry was out here. This one is another one of the mixed use ones. This was a tugboat and passenger ferry. You can see everybody in their Sunday best up top there. You can also see the bridge that crossed over City Waterway. So this is looking eastward across what is the Foss Waterway today. And that trestle bridge up there was the bridge that would later be replaced by the 11th Street Bridge right there. And so this is the Fossberg. It's only a 15-ton, 100 horsepower tugboat that's 64 feet in length. And this was built in 1912 in Gig Harbor. And a lot of shipbuilding industry was shared in between Gig Harbor and Tacoma. Tacoma had hands down the largest of the shipbuilding shipwright companies in the area, but Gig Harbor did quite a few of their own as well, including a lot of the fishing vessels from that time. I'm trying to see if I can get a good one for you here. I'll show you the Shenandoah here in a little bit. Here's a up close shot of Foss number 12, and then you can see them in action here. This is Foss number 12 fighting one of the many grain warehouse fires there in 1914. And this was, again, a 43-foot vessel, so you can get some comparison there. This is the same tugboat that was bringing those 600-ton concrete blocks to the Narrows Bridge anchors. But here it is serving in its day job of bringing peace to the community out here. And right in the back there, you can see it where it says Union Oil. That is still a fuel depot today. If you go down to the Foss Waterway, and if you're interested, we are still doing our kayak tours of the Foss Waterway, operating with the Foss Waterway Seaport. But that is essentially the location where Phillips 66 is today. And a lot of people know it affectionately as the Olympic Torch. If you've ever been down on the waterfront, you've probably seen that large fire that shows up every now and then. That's off-gassing for the Phillips 66. And that is that location where Union Oil is today. So you can see it. Let's see if we can get that marker up again. Right over here. And of course, when you have a fuel depot and then endless timber industry down there, things catch fire. This is one of my favorite photos. So local icon William Case, or Bill Case, was a soldier for the U.S. military. He ends up moving to the area here and working through the ranks of the Foss Company. He becomes their lead dispatcher late in his life, but he was in command of Foss number 12. And this is his son posing on the tugboat here when Foss 12 was taken over. And Bill Case, I think, has some of the most fascinating history in the area here. Not only did he work for the remainder of his life for the Foss Company, he was the skipper for Foss 12 for the longest period of time before he ends up getting promoted there. And I did a story on him recently. He bought a vessel that was an old lifeboat towed into the Tacoma area that he renamed the Baby Dumpling. But it was like, I believe, like a 30-foot lifeboat that a Pacific cargo vessel found floating in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. They towed it into Tacoma and just sold it as surplus, but it had several emergency water ration cans empty inside, couple packages of empty biscuits from emergency rations, as well as cigarette cartons from Australia. And the entire thing had been blasted up with 38 caliber bullets. And to this day, nobody knows where it came from, what happened to it, or where the people who were surviving on board ended up. But it's not on any missing roster of vessels that have sunk that I've ever been able to find. So if you know anything about missing lifeboats in the Pacific Ocean in the 1930s, keep me posted because I'm deeply curious about it. But it ends up getting bought by Mr. William Case, turned into a pleasure craft, and then served on the waterfront down here in Tacoma for quite some time. Here's this is the first professional fireboat. So while the understanding was originally that the Foss Company would get their own tugboats and then create the apparatus on them to fight fires, eventually the city of Tacoma was like, you know what? We're going to just need to get something to be useful for this. So this is fireboat number 1, 96 feet, 6 inches long, with a 21-foot, 6-inch beam and a 6-foot draft. And you can count them. There are seven high-intensity water cannons on this bad boy, which can produce 10,000 gallons per minute. And one of the benefits of this one was the steel deck and pilot house. Obviously, if you're fighting fires, you don't want to have any risk of your vessel catching fire. And this was a 425 horsepower gasoline engine fire fighting vessel down here in Tacoma. And it was fireboat number 1, built in 1929 for the port of Tacoma. And here's a little peek at the beating heart of this beast out there. And the irony of this is fireboat number 1 was the most successful firefighter of all the workboats that ever went up and down the coast out here. This is from 1936. Fireboat number 1 was stationed at the fireboat station right down there in City Waterway. And one and only time was she ever taken out of the water to be dry docked so that they could repair various things that needed to be. And that happened to be, I believe, 2 days before the Centennial Mills fire began and spread out of control, destroying the 8-story grain storage building pictured right here down on the waterfront. And this was the only time, right? The only time that the city's most useful weapon for combating fires had been taken out of the water and the engines had been removed to get them refurbished and replaced. The irony is almost too brutal. Here's a great shot of an interesting Tacoma story tied to workboats. This is the German cruiser, the Karlsruhe, taking on fuel from a Foss barge out here. One of the workboats was the Foss barge that would refuel vessels. And this is 1934. So you can sink this into the timeline of where we are in our relationship with Germany at this time. But it was right at the time where things were starting to get dicey around the world, but we were still okay with Germany. And so their vessel here came, took on fuel in Port of Tacoma. And it is one of the tragedies of the area because a young sailor on board on this 6,000-ton vessel that had 3 turrets and 4 torpedo tubes was a machinist, a machinist's mate, I believe, actually, a guy named Carl Lickschi, and he died March 17th, 1934. Why? Food poisoning. His fiancée shipped him a package of fish to give him a little treat and a taste of home, and the fish went bad. And so when he ate it, he died on board from extreme food poisoning and ends up getting buried with full naval rights at Mountain View Memorial Park Cemetery, where if you go out today, you can still find his burial site here. This is from the ceremony. The military escorted him down off of that vessel, and then he was buried out there. He has the German all over his final resting place as well. But if you're curious why a German died in Tacoma in 1934, well, it was love and bad fish, which I think have probably hurt us all at some point or another. This is a picture from June of 1948. The Tacoma Boat Building Company completed the Scarlet Queen. And remember, I mentioned so many of these wooden vessels were being produced in Tacoma, and not just tugboats, but a whole variety: wooden minesweepers, tugboats, and fishing vessels. The Scarlet Queen at the time in 1948 was declared the largest tuna clipper in the world at 165 feet long and 35 feet wide. This was eventually converted from a fishing vessel to a naval ship. A few years after it was built, they requisitioned it and then turned it back over. And this was, I'm trying to think here, had an 1,800 horsepower diesel engine at the time. Absolutely massive. And this kind of kicked off a phase in Tacoma's history where a lot of these workboats were being produced by people in the area. Because you have a population of shipwrights, you end up with guys like this. So this gentleman, I'm going to butcher the name, and I apologize for that. I'm saying Alavidas Kapakaskas. Is that accurate? Probably not. He's a Lithuanian-born gentleman who emigrated to the United States, lived here in Tacoma, and as a fisher, wanted to create his own vessel, and at a cost of $19,000, built and outfitted his own 55-foot fishing boat that he would use as a commercial fishing boat for salmon and tuna. And he built it not just in Northeast Tacoma, but out of concrete. You can look this vessel up. Her name is the Era. It has I'm trying to think how deep the draft was on this, but it only took him, I think, just over a year. And this is ferro cement. And he did almost the entirety of the work himself to create this. And there are a few cement boats out there. All of them terrify me. Like, I understand the science. You can talk to me about ferro cement all day if you want to. I don't like it. I still don't. As far as I'm concerned, most vessels should be built out of wood. I understand that that's not practical all the time, but listen, wood is positively buoyant. It has a good vibe to it. It is a great thing for building vessels. I understand if you have to make it out of metal or fiberglass. I'm still a little uncomfortable with that. Wood is my go-to for this. Concrete? Absolutely not. I dislike it so much. So that's that. But if you're interested more about Mr. K, his concrete vessel, I have not been able to locate. At some point, the Era vanished from the rosters, and I think it's because it was renamed, which is pretty common for that. But as far as I can tell, it's still out there somewhere. Speaking of vessels that are still out there, the Virginia 5 is a great example of the Mosquito fleet, like we were talking about sooner. And the Mosquito fleet really vanished. One of the best collections of Mosquito fleet paraphernalia and history that you'll be able to find is actually at the Foss Seaport today. I encourage you to go. But they received the entire collection that used to be out on Stretch Island. And a gentleman out there by the name of Bill who worked with the Mosquito Fleet in the early day, well, I guess the late days of the Mosquito Fleet, the early days for him, ends up purchasing bits of them as each of these vessels is very quietly decommissioned. And nobody knew that it was the end of the era for the Mosquito Fleet as it was happening. It was something that showed up retroactively, and they're like, wow, we're going to have to do a bunch of history on this. And Bill luckily went out, got all these various pieces of those vessels, showcased a collection that during his death was donated to the Foss Waterway Seaport Museum. And of the Mosquito Fleet vessels that are still operating, the Virginia 5 is perhaps the most notable. It was went on its maiden voyage in 1922 as part of the Mosquito Fleet operating exclusively in Puget Sound. Ends up having a whole, varied career, not just as a passenger ferry, but also moving crops and livestock from farms on Vashon Island, and then maintained the route between Seattle and Tacoma, as well as going all over through Colville's Passage. And then I believe at the end, it was Vashon Island and Kitsap Peninsula as a ferry from 1922 to 1938. And then operates today not just as a wonderful wedding venue, but sort of an educational vessel. So you can book passage on the Virginia 5 and actually cruise around Puget Sound. They do quite a few educational runs or charters throughout the area right now, but it's a really good way. If you're interested, the Virginia 5 Foundation maintains a really excellent website talking a lot more about what they do out there. One of the ones that's also pretty representative out there is the Arcadia. This is a steam vessel in the area, or the Carmelita. The Carmelita II here underwent sea trials in Old Tacoma as a fishing vessel, 55 feet long, in 1950. So we were still a very active commercial fishing port into the middle of the 1900s. And you can see this classic, this is just a beauty shot right here. But it was such an important part of our industry that this picture, I think, speaks volumes. So this is the launch party for, I believe, the Carmelita II. And that is our mayor at the time, Val Fawcett. Right, he's the third from the left, white shirt, bow tie. And, oh no, this isn't the Carmelita. This would have been the American Girl. This is a tuna vessel that came out here. And this was built by the Petrick Shipbuilding Company, which still has offices and historic locations down on the waterfront in Foss Waterway to this very day. Yeah, there we go. This is the glamour shot of the American Girl. A lot of these tuna fishing vessels were built in the Tacoma area or launched in the Tacoma area and then would operate up and down the Pacific coast all the way up to Alaska. And perhaps the most famous of them all is the Western Flyer. Now, if you don't know the Western Flyer, it was built like so many of the vessels in the area by a Croatian immigrant, Mr. Martin Petrick. He's the guy who founded and operated the Petrick Shipbuilding Company down there on the Foss Waterway. The Western Flyer, built here in Tacoma, launches with the purpose of being a fishing vessel, but is commissioned and chartered while under command of its captain, Mr. Petrick, as a vessel for John Steinbeck. This is where it really gets famous. John Steinbeck and his marine scientist buddy end up chartering this vessel, the Western Flyer, and they go up and down the coast of California. And I'm trying to remember what year this was. It was captained at the time by Tony Berry. Tony Berry was the son of Frank Berry. Frank Berry and Mr. Petrick were in business together. Frank Berry has some wild stories of his time up in Old Town. But Tony Berry was the captain, I believe, of the Western Flyer when it was working as a sardine fishing vessel along the coast of California, and then got chartered for Steinbeck's voyage in there, where he ends up writing the log from the Sea of Cortez. And if you're not familiar, the log from the Sea of Cortez ends up being a really inspirational book, perhaps one of Steinbeck's most valuable and worthwhile, I think. And it's the first book that he writes after Grapes of Wrath. And as opposed to a lot of fictionalized adventure novels, is really this inspirational look at marine science adventure and kind of early conservation efforts. And they're looking at the way that the California coast had changed and marine life in the area and sort of this forward look at what America was about to become. It goes on to inspire entire generations, not just of marine biologists and geologists, but also just people interested in the story of the United States. And so it was written by Steinbeck from the desk on board the vessel, the Western Flyer here. Here's a picture of the chart room with the desk. But the thing about the Western Flyer was that it disappeared for a long time. So it ends up going on after being chartered by Steinbeck to continue operating as a fishing vessel. It eventually gets renamed the Gemini and then lost until this gentleman who was inspired by the story that Steinbeck wrote ends up looking for it and finds it after it had really just been demolished. I think it operated as a fishing vessel under the ownership of a Norwegian captain, a guy named Ole Knutsen, who operated it until 1993, if I'm not mistaken, where he decided to retire. He ends up selling it for $100,000, now named the Inia, and goes on to just change hands a few more times until it eventually, in 2012, I think, sinks, not once, but twice. Here it is in its absolute saddest state, but gets purchased in 2015 by a gentleman named John Gregg. And John Gregg buys it for the astronomical price of $1 million and then enlists the skill and expertise of the Port Townsend Shipwrights Co-op, who painstakingly restore this wooden vessel back to its historic and operational glory, while also modernizing it enough that it's now safe to go at sea. And just in June of 2022, so just last year, the Western Flyer relaunches and goes back out to sea, and you can visit it today. It cruises all over Puget Sound now as an educational vessel, continuing the work that Steinbeck originally intended for his novel of teaching people about the region here. So you can see, fittingly enough, it's getting brought out to sea by a tugboat. And it remains one of the operational workboats out here in Puget Sound today, really sort of inspiring people to get involved in the story of Puget Sound as a workboat capital on the West Coast. Another one here that I've got for you, this is the Shenandoah. So the Shenandoah was a fishing vessel built in the area in 1925, and then it too sank and was in absolute disrepair until the Maritime Heritage Museum in Gig Harbor purchased it in 2000. And is in the process, this is kind of a before and after you can see, of restoring it out there. And this one isn't going to go back to sea. This is going to remain a permanent exhibit in this space curated especially for it on the side of the Heritage Museum out there. But here's a picture taken not long after it originally launched out there. And that's what I think is so extraordinary about this, is that the work vessels in this area, from fishing vessels to tugboats to even this one here, this is one of the original just small craft that was handmade by Andrew Foss. And the legacy of this area here goes so much deeper than people think. In the middle of the 1900s, Andrew Foss designed a specialty teardrop hull design for tugboats that made them infinitely more stable and safe, and had the opportunity to patent it and refused. He thought it was more valuable that fishermen and tugboat captains would be safe at sea than that he turn a profit from it. And that's just sort of the attitude that went throughout here. And I think one of the many reasons why tugboat captains in the area here became sort of creatures of mythology. And when you go around the area here, there's still quietly the unsung heroes of this region. And so if you have the opportunity to go see any of the Mosquito Fleet passenger vessels, including the Virginia 5, or any of those really classic tugboats from the area, the Chippewa, the the Creosote, or the Andrew Foss, absolutely do, because they are the iconic reason that the Puget Sound flourished the way that it did, specifically during the Depression era. So there you go. Whew, man. Yeah. So I'm going to go through the questions. Yeah. Concrete. It's like, why? You just want your vessel to sink. I get it. I understand. I just hate it. So yeah. A lot of people assume the Western Flyer is just a toy wagon, but in fact, it is one of the most famous. It's like, I'm trying to think what it is. There's certain things where only people who are really into it, like the people that read all of Tolkien and then really followed the movies and want to buy the collectible pieces that were used on set. That's the kind of stuff. Like Lord of the Rings people have the same fervor that tugboat aficionados do. And so a lot of those workboats that disappeared off the map are now being purchased by people who were inspired by them in the 1950s and 60s and refurbished in the area and given a new opportunity to sing their story. So shoot. If you guys have questions, let me know. But thank you for joining me tonight and exploring the passion of the working maritime industry here in Puget Sound, specifically Tacoma. And if you get an opportunity to check out Tugboat Annie, please do. I think it has maintained its entertainment value despite being produced almost 100 years ago. So thank you for tuning in. I will see you guys very soon. Please join us for a whole variety of things. And if you'd like to see a closer look of the Foss Waterway, we still are operating our kayak tour in partnership with the Foss Waterway Seaport. You can find that online under prettygrittytours.com. Until next time, my friends, get out there, keep on exploring. I'll see you soon.